Mr. Paulson votes aye. Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
The chairman votes no. Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 30 ayes and 39 noes.
And the amendment is defeated. The question now comes on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Moore, regarding the escrow. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kanjorski. Mr. Kanjorski votes no. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters votes aye. Mrs. Maloney. Ms. Waters? Ms. Waters, did you say off aye on no? Thank you. Mrs. Maloney? Mrs. Maloney votes no. Mr. Gutierrez? Mr. Gutierrez votes no. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes no. Mr. Watt? Mr. Watt votes no. Mr. Ackerman? Mr. Ackerman votes no. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman votes no. Mr. Meeks? Mr. Meeks votes no. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. Capuano? Mr. Capuano votes no. Mr. Hinojosa? Mr. Hinojosa votes no. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes no. Mrs. McCarthy? Mrs. McCarthy votes no. Mr. Baca? Mr. Baca votes no. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Cleaver? Mr. Cleaver votes no. Ms. Bean? Ms. Bean votes aye. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Hodes? Mr. Hodes votes no. Mr. Ellison? Mr. Ellison votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter passes. Mr. Donnelly? Mr. Donnelly votes aye. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes aye. Mr. Carson? Mr. Carson votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Childers? Mr. Childer passes. Mr. Minnick? Mr. Minnick votes aye. Mr. Adler? Mr. Adler votes aye. Ms. Kilroy? Ms. Kilroy votes no. Mr. Driehaus? Mr. Driehaus votes aye. Ms. Cosmas? Ms. Cosmas votes no. Mr. Grayson? Mr. Grayson votes no. Mr. Himes? Mr. Himes passes. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes no. Mr. Maffei? Pardon me? Mr. Maffei votes aye. Mr. Backus? Mr. Backus votes aye. Mr. Nagelbauer? Mr. Nagelbauer votes aye. Mr. Castle? Mr. Castle votes aye. Mr. King? Mr. Royce? Mr. Royce votes aye. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas votes aye. Mr. Paul? Mr. Manzullo? Mr. Manzullo votes aye. Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones votes aye. Mrs. Biggert? Mrs. Biggert votes aye. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes aye. Mrs. Capito? Mrs. Capito votes aye. Mr. Henserling? Mr. Henserling votes aye. Mr. Garrett? Mr. Garrett votes aye. Mr. Barrett? Mr. Barrett votes aye. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach votes aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price votes aye. Mr. McHenry? Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mr. Campbell? Mr. Campbell votes aye. Mr. Putnam? Mr. Putnam votes aye. Mrs. Bachman? Mrs. Bachman votes aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant votes aye. Mr. McCotter? Mr. McCotter votes aye. Mr. McCarthy? Mr. McCarthy votes aye. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins votes aye. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee votes aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson votes aye. Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance votes aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Chairman votes no.
The clerk will please. Oh, the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes.
Mr. Himes votes aye.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr.
Mr. Perlmutter votes aye.
The gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Childers.
Mr. Childers votes aye.
Are there any more late returns from the paper ballot counties? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, the ayes are 39 and the noes are 30.
And the amendment is agreed to. The question now comes on passing the bill 4868. No roll call has yet been ordered, but one can be at the conclusion of the voice vote. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. The ayes have it, and the
Mr.
bill is
Chairman.
passed. The gentleman from Alabama requests a roll
On that,
call.
we request a roll
Those
call.
joining with him will signify. A sufficient number, the clerk will call the roll on passage of H.R. 4868 as amended.
Mr. Kandrowski? Aye. Mr. Kandrowski votes aye. Ms. Waters? Aye. Ms. Waters votes aye. Mrs. Maloney? Aye. Mrs. Maloney votes aye. Mr. Gutierrez? Aye. Mr. Gutierrez votes aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Watt? Mr. Watt votes aye. Mr. Ackerman? Mr. Ackerman votes aye. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks? Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. Capuano? Mr. Capuano votes aye. Mr. Unoza? Mr. Unoza votes aye. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes aye. Mrs. McCarthy? Mrs. McCarthy votes aye. Mr. Baca? Mr. Baca votes aye. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver? Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Ms. Bean? Ms. Bean votes aye. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Hodes? Mr. Hodes votes aye. Mr. Ellison? Mr. Ellison votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Wilson? Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Donnelly? Mr. Donnelly votes aye. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster votes aye. Mr. Carson? Mr. Carson votes aye. Ms. Spear?
Come see me.
Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Childers? Mr. Childers votes aye. Mr. Minnick? Mr. Minnick votes aye. Mr. Adler? Mr. Adler votes aye. Ms. Kilroy? Ms. Kilroy votes aye. Mr. Driehaus? Mr. Driehaus votes aye. Ms. Cosmas? Ms. Cosmas votes aye. Mr. Grayson? Mr. Grayson votes aye. Mr. Himes? Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye. Mr. Maffei? Mr. Maffei votes aye. Mr. Backus? Mr. Backus votes no. Mr. Nagelbauer? Mr. Nagelbauer votes no. Mr. Castle? Mr. Castle votes no. Mr. King? Mr. Royce? Mr. Royce votes no. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Paul? Mr. Manzullo? Mr. Manzullo votes no. Mr. Jones? Mr. Jones votes no. Mrs. Biggert? Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Miller? Mr. Miller votes no. Mrs. Capito? Mrs. Capito votes no. Mr. Henserling? Mr. Henserling votes no. Mr. Garrett? Mr. Garrett votes no. Mr. Barrett? Mr. Barrett votes no. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach votes no. Mr. Price? Mr. McHenry? Mr. McHenry votes no. Mr. Price? Okay. Mr. Price votes no. Mr. McHenry? Mr. McHenry votes no. Mr. Campbell? Mr. Campbell votes no. Mr. Putnam? Mr. Putnam votes no. Mrs. Bachman? Mrs. Bachman votes no. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant votes no. Mr. McCotter? Mr. McCotter votes no. Mr. McCarthy? Mr. McCarthy votes no. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey votes no. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins votes no. Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee votes no. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson votes no. Mr. Lance? Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
The chairman votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 41 ayes and 27. Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there are 42 ayes and 27 noes.
And the bill is ordered reported. The question now comes on ordering reported H.R. 5814. A voice vote comes first. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. And the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Neugebauer, asked for a roll call. Those joining with him will signify. The sufficient number, a roll call will be ordered, and members may vote and leave. Since this is the last business to come before us, we will meet promptly at 10 tomorrow. We have two contentious bills and three others that are not so contentious, and I believe we will be able to complete the agenda fairly tomorrow in a reasonable period of time. So the question...
Mr. Chairman, do you know what order they'll be in?
Yeah, the gambling bill will be first. The Al Green bill will be second. The Capuano bill will be third. The Kilroy bill will be fourth. And the Garrett bill will be fifth. And with that, the clerk will call the roll on ordering 5814, the public housing bill.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I don't know, there might have been some confusion earlier today. I had asked for
I wouldn't be surprised if there were.
I had asked for a report to be put into the legislation. I'm asking now for unanimous consent.
I said unanimous consent at that time.
I thought you did, but someone told me no.
Well, don't listen to that person. Listen to me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Kanjorski. Yes. Mr. Kanjorski votes aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters votes aye. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney votes aye. Mr. Gutierrez. Mr. Gutierrez votes aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez votes aye. Mr. Watt. Mr. Watt votes aye. Mr. Ackerman. Mr. Ackerman votes aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman votes aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks votes aye. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano votes aye. Mr. Hinojosa. Mr. Hinojosa votes aye. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay votes aye. Mrs. McCarthy. Mrs. McCarthy votes aye. Mr. Baca. Mr. Baca votes aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Ms. Bean. Ms. Bean votes aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Hodes. Mr. Hodes votes aye. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison votes aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Wilson. Mr. Wilson votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly votes aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster votes aye. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes aye. Ms. Spear. Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Childers. Mr. Childers votes aye. Mr. Minnick. Mr. Minnick votes aye. Mr. Adler. Mr. Adler votes aye.
Would members please be quiet on the way out in fairness to the clerk? Clerk will resume.
Ms. Kilroy. Ms. Kilroy votes aye. Mr. Driehaus. Mr. Driehaus votes aye. Ms. Cosmos. Ms. Cosmos votes aye. Mr. Grayson. Mr. Grayson votes aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes aye. Mr. Maffei. Mr. Maffei votes aye. Mr. Backus. Mr. Backus votes no. Mr. Nagerbauer. Mr. Nagerbauer. Mr. Nagerbauer votes no. Mr. Castle. Mr. Castle votes no. Mr. King. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce votes no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas votes no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Manzullo. Mr. Manzullo votes no. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones votes no. Mrs. Biggert. Mrs. Biggert votes no. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes no. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito votes no. Mr. Henserling. Mr. Henserling votes no. Mr. Garrett. Mr. Garrett votes no. Mr. Barrett. Mr. Barrett votes no. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Gerlach votes no. Mr. Price. Mr. Price votes no. Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry votes no. Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell votes no. Mr. Putnam. Mr. Putnam votes no. Mrs. Bachman. Mrs. Bachman votes no. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant votes no. Mr. McCotter. Mr. McCotter votes no. Mr. McCarthy. Mr. McCarthy votes no. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey votes no. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins votes no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee votes no. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson votes no. Mr. Lance. Mr. Lance votes no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman votes aye.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on that roll call, the ayes are 42 and the noes are 27.
And the bill is passed. Without objection, both bills will be reported. The staff will be empowered to make technical changes and corrections of errors, and members will have a lot of time to file their reports because we'll see in September. And the gentlewoman from Ohio asks unanimous consent to make a statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Gentleman from Ohio.
I ask unanimous consent to let the record reflect that on H.R. 4868, on the Waters Amendment to the Price Amendment on guns as modified by McCarthy. If I had been present, I would have voted yes. And on the Price Amendment on guns, I voted yes, but I meant to vote no.
Without objection, as I said, the gentlewoman had the floor, so those statements will be in the record. Let me say to other members, if there are explanatory statements of votes that members wish to include, they may be included. We are now in recess at this markup, and we will reconvene at 10 a.m. promptly tomorrow morning.